Thanks, Mel, for the introduction. I always find it a challenge to give a presentation for Mel and his group or his project, because I have the feeling always that pretty much, or a lot of the things I know, I've learned them from him. So it's always a pleasure and an honor. So today, like Mel was saying, I've been working pretty much my whole career on crowd simulation and many other aspects that influence crowd simulation, like animating the virtual characters so they actually appear to be performing tasks in the virtual environment. We've also been working with appearance of these virtual characters just to see which kind of visualization could work better in each of the situations where we need to use them. And recently, for example, we are also working on trying to populate a large environment or try to author large environments with crowds that have meaningful behavior. So for instance, build environments with semantic information that can be used to drive the movement of the people that live within the city, a little bit with the purpose of being able to populate these environments and give background or ambient characters to these environments in an easier way, and not to have to be basically scripting all the behaviors of all the people that will be, of all the virtual characters that will be appearing in the simulation. So we've done a bit of work, and we're working on this field within a European ITN network that we have at the moment, and trying to use procedural models to generate both the environments and the people. But I didn't want to go too much into detail with this topic, because I want to talk more about how we're using virtual avatars within immersive virtual reality. So why or where are we using avatars currently? So we are using avatars, as I was saying, to populate environments with the purpose of studying human behavior. And here what you have mostly is autonomous virtual agents that need to have some things, some tasks assigned so that they can give the appearance that you are in a real situation, and we can study how people behave, for example, in the case of an emergency. We are also using virtual avatars to represent other people in collaborative virtual reality. So when we have to be interacting with others in collaborative VR, be able to study how we behave, how we move around others, to try to make these experiences as similar as possible to how we would collaborate in the real world. And finally, we're also working on animating correctly your self-avatar, so that when you're immersed in virtual reality and you have a first-person view of your own avatar, we can try to guarantee that the movements of the virtual avatar will be as similar as possible to yours, hopefully with just sparse input data, just a few trackers. So when it comes to representing large groups of agents in virtual reality and studying human behavior, we have run experiments to evaluate, for instance, in the case of a train station. Given that you walk in this train station, you have a series of tasks that you have to do. So you walk through the main doors, you have to buy some tickets, you have to go to some machine to get a drink, then you have to walk to a platform. And while you're doing all these tasks in the virtual environment, you walk nearby other virtual characters that will at least perform collision avoidance against you, so you don't walk through them. It's an environment where we have a very hidden exit. You can see it on the floor plan on the right-hand side, which is at the end of a long corridor and hidden under a lot of shops. And then there's another obvious exit on the left-hand side that all the all the participants will see when they walk to the platform, and then they walk back. So at some point in this experiment, there'll be an alarm going off, and you will hear the noise. You see some flashing red light, and we have a percentage of agents that will start running towards the hidden exit. So we want to see, in the case of a real of a simulated evacuation, based on what the virtual characters would do, what would be the reaction of the participants? What would be the decision making of the participants? So you can see here, we walk through the obvious exit, and as you get to this green machine at the end, we will see the alarm going off, and we will see how the participants start running towards the exit. Okay, so we run these experiments having three cases: one where everybody would run towards the exit, another one where only half the population in the virtual train station would run towards the exit, and the final case where nobody would run. People would just continue walking around doing just randomly assigned tasks within the environment. And we wanted to study the user behavior in this situation. So what we found, for instance, in this experiment was basically that the number of people, the number of people running towards an exit did influence the decision making. So, for instance, here we have on the left-hand side is the case where all the participants run towards an exit. In the center, we have the case where only half of the crowd started running. And on the right-hand side, we have the case where nobody would start running. People would just, virtual avatars would just continue with their activities. So basically, when everybody would run, all the avatars would run towards the exit, pretty much all participants, 90% of them, immediately started running following the participants and left the building through the hidden exit just by following all the crowd. In the center, we have the case where only half of the people started running. And this is interesting because even though we still got all participants following those that were running, we can see here in the bar two colors. The light color indicates the percentage of participants, so more than 50% of them first walked towards the main entrance door. The ones they knew because they had walked in through those doors. And when they got there and they found those doors closed, then they walked back and they started following the the virtual avatars that were running towards the exit. So even though they all follow, we start seeing some initiative of deciding on their own something to do before following the crowd. And on the right-hand side, where participants continue with the whereabouts, we notice that all participants first check the entrance doors, and then almost about 65 of them found the most obvious exit, and there was a smaller percentage of them that found the hidden exit. And when we interviewed them after the experiment, they basically told us that they walked to the main door, they found it closed, and when they turned around, they happened to see a handful of avatars that they had their next assigned task, being to leave through this exit, to this hidden exit. And because they saw a group of them walking towards that corridor, they assumed they knew where they were going and they decided to follow them. So we can see here a clear influence on decision making based on the behavior of the crowd. And we also noticed that there was a correlation between the level of nervousness and the exit choice. So for instance, those that reported higher level of nervousness were more likely to follow the crowd, whether those that reported to be more relaxed and less nervous were the ones that found the alternative exit. So with this experiment, we tested that, yes, that people do follow others also in virtual reality. We tried the experiment including fire, and the results we got were pretty much the same. So basically, adding fire to this environment didn't give us significant differences between the two scenarios. The fire was relatively far away from the position where people were located when the alarm went off, and somehow it didn't increase much the level of stress. And what we learned from this experiment is basically, like I was saying, people do tend to follow others. Under stress, most people won't decide on their own. With low stress levels, people are most likely to explore the environment. And we believe that the reasons why we didn't see more differences when we had fire included, for example, would probably have to do with the expressiveness of the avatars. In these experiments, avatars were only walking around, performing tasks, and at some point they would start running, but they had no facial expressions. They did not show alarm on their faces. They did not show surprise. And we our feeling with this experiment was that we need to include more emotions into the avatars animations for these experiments to work better. So for example, here we have an example of a crowd simulation model where we simply have people walking around. And if we show this to participants in a perceptual study and ask them about the realism of this simulation, we often find that the levels of realism drop because there's these characters here who appear to be doing nothing, appear to just suddenly stop, walk in circles, or just turn around without apparently doing anything in the virtual environment. And this reduces the overall realism of the entire simulation. However, if we simply assign them some animations that give an explanation to this behavior, the overall simulation immediately appears more realistic. So here we have the same simulation, same simulator, but now we did that when anybody starts walking in circles, not doing much, the velocity coming from the crowd simulator simply stops or moves in circles. We simply added a cell phone in this virtual avatar's hands. And automatically, if you show this to people, it immediately appears more realistic than the first simulation. And basically, the reason is that the animations are giving some meaning to the overall behavior, to the overall trajectories of these characters. So we tried to, I mean, there's been a lot of work in the literature studying the impact of avatars' appearance and even illumination, for example, in how we perceive emotions, how we perceive virtual humans. Also, taking into account, for instance, in the case of immersive virtual reality, how presence increase, for example, with the virtual agents acknowledge you in a way of, for example, gesturing at you or gazing at you or getting in any kind of interaction, no matter how small it is, with the participant can increase presence in these virtual environments. So we wanted to study the differences in perceiving the realism of a crowd based on animation types, based on having only locomotion, only people walking around, or having locomotion but accompanied by other animations such as gesturing, talking on the phone, sitting on benches, and so on. And also study the impact of appearance, whether we had only like a robot-looking avatar or a human-looking avatar. We use the Microsoft Rocketbot library for this experiment to have a larger variety of characters in the environment. And we compare these combinations of having bots with locomotions, bots with animations, humans with locomotions, and humans with animation variety. So unfortunately, we were preparing this experiment to be run in virtual reality, but then COVID came, and we could not run these experiments in virtual reality. So we moved quickly everything to web-based and just seeing these videos on a computer, on a laptop, from home, and running all the questionnaires online. And we compare, like you can see here, bots with locomotion only. Then we have the bots with animation, so they're sitting down, they're talking on the phone, they're gesturing with others. They start to bring a bit more life to this virtual environment. Then we do the same, but with humanoids. So we have people that only walk around, and maybe when they encounter others, they might just stop in place without any kind of interaction with the others or with the environment. So for instance, here we see a person just walking towards a bench and stopping there without sitting down. And then we have the case where we include animation variety. So participants sit down, gesture to others, talk on the phone, they carry objects, they start showing a larger variety of animations, giving more meaning and more life to these environments. So through the user experiments that we did with these four scenarios that we have seen here, what we found basically is that there was an interaction effect between the animation type and the appearance, but we didn't find a main effect on only one of the variables. So for example, animations would increase a bit the realism of the overall simulation of the trajectories and the animation appearance overall, but not with a statistically significant difference. And actually, for the case of evaluating trajectories, that is something we do very often in crowd simulation, we actually noticed that having bots with animation variety would give higher realism to the trajectories than having humanoids that were only walking around. So this is an interesting element that is probably related with the well-known uncanny valley. So basically, we observed that animations can have an impact when it comes to perceiving realism. And appearance alone did not seem to have such an impact. The impact of animation was slightly higher than the impact of appearance, although in many cases, I insist, we only saw a trend when it came to animation, but not a statistically significant difference. And it would be interesting to run these experiments in VR, but the problem here basically, and I believe the reason why we didn't find a larger difference when it came to animation variety, is because humans are very sensitive to any artifacts when it comes to animation. So even though we had animation variety, there are still small elements of the animations that are not completely smooth, that are not completely polished. And as a matter of fact, we did a quick pilot experiment in virtual reality with these scenarios. And in virtual reality, we could not perform these experiments with the animations we had at the time, because they required to be even more polished, even more smooth, even nicer interpolations and nicer interaction with the environment for these animations to be believable in virtual reality. So it is a big challenge when we're trying to evaluate these things in virtual reality, because once characters have the same size as the user, we become way more sensitive to how they behave. So the second case of representing others, we have done a bit of work in virtual reality, collaborative virtual reality, for the purpose of architecture and teaching. And typically, we have done experiments, for example, with architects, where we only had this kind of floating heads that you can see here. And for the architects, this was enough to communicate relevant information, such as where's the other person looking at, and having virtual arrays traced from the controllers. It was enough to tell the other person, look at this point, or indicate what you're referring to. We have used this representation also for teaching and anatomy, and often this simplistic representation, it's enough to just communicate information between the people involved in the collaborative virtual reality experiences. But ideally, you want to move this a bit farther and have full avatars. What we typically see in video games, because of the difficulty of having full avatars correctly animated, is this kind of representation of floating bodies and maybe floating hands in the air that give us a bit of just the basic information that we can get from the other user, which is head movements and hand movements. But if we go a bit further, we have full avatars. Again, there's work in the literature to study humans moving around a virtual crowd in a cave, for example, or even the one at the bottom studying people moving around each other with avatars that are animated with inverse kinematics. And in the experiments we ran, we didn't want to use inverse kinematics at the time because we didn't have a full high-quality motion capture shoot. And what we realized with IK often is that it introduces small artifacts like vibrations around the knees, or maybe incorrect position of certain body parts, or even animation jumps that that make you not fully trust the other person that is interacting with you. So what we did here is we used just walking animations, the upper body, the hands, incorporated inverse kinematics to have correct gesturing and correct hand movement. And the simulations of the animations were run based on the velocity of the head-mounted display and interpolated between different animations just based on the head-mounted display. So with this, we wanted to study how we move around others, what velocities we keep, and information about clearance, what distance we keep from others in virtual reality. And in this experiment, what we observed is that, similarly to the literature, it's been observed that running the same experiment in VR or without VR, so just putting the head-mounted display on top of on the head of the person, so every other limitation of the setup is the same. We noticed that when we're in the real world, we do this task faster and in shorter time, obviously. So there's still some issues in virtual reality that makes us not fully believe that the physical objects in the real room are not going to be making us collide or causing any kind of incident. However, when it came to the other avatar, to moving around the avatar of the other participant, the fact that the animations were smooth for this particular experiment allowed us to have clearance between participants that was much smaller than what we had observed in the literature when animations were done with inverse kinematics, and thus with all the artifacts that can be introduced due to sensors or due to IK solutions. So we are hopeful that by improving the animations in virtual reality, we will be able to behave in these environments in a much natural manner, and we will be able to interact with others in this environment like we would do in the real world. Also, when it came to communication strategies, for example, it was interesting in this experiment that the head-mounted display was simply used to animate the full avatar, but there was no eye contact, and there was not even nodding. There was not even movements of the head by itself. So we noticed that people would interact, would communicate by talking to each other or gesturing with the hands. It is the part of the body they realized the animations correspond to their own movements, and therefore they would use that for non-verbal communication. Now, the last part I want to talk about what we're doing, where we're putting more effort lately, is the part on representing the user. No, so we want to have the person in virtual reality having its own avatar, moving as closely as possible to how you are moving in the real world. And again, when it comes to video games, often what we find is just, again, floating hands that can interact, can do basic gestures, and maybe sometimes you have a hand with a bit of a long glove, so it gives more the feeling that you're in the environment. But you hardly ever see full avatars in games nowadays because of the lack of correspondence between the movements of the avatar, the difficulty of getting correct movements for the avatar that correspond to your own. And this is something that when you are observing your own avatar and you know from your proprioceptive system, you know exactly what you're doing and how your hands and your arms are positioned, it is way more obvious to you if something is not quite right. So we've done recently a work basically to just get any virtual avatar and through a very quick setup, be able to have it up and running in any virtual environment very quickly. So basically the idea is that if you want your virtual avatar to move correctly, even if you have very good inverse kinematics and you use a few trackers, the main thing that you need to solve first is to make sure that the avatar dimensions correspond to your own as much as possible. And the other very important thing is to have exact correspondence between the position and orientation of the trackers and the position and orientation of the joints of the avatar. So in this work, I'll move to the setup. Basically, we have developed an asset you can drag and drop in any virtual reality application developed in Unity. You walk in your virtual avatar, you can see it from a first-person perspective. You make sure your feet are located inside the avatar's feet, and so are the hands. And then you just trigger a button, and immediately you have your own avatar moving like you. We can see here how we can use the pass-through camera of the head-mounted display to make sure to compare your own pose with the avatar's pose. And of course, there's going to be some mismatches sometimes around the knees and the elbows because we're not tracking those. But overall, the whole movement is quite nice, and there's a good correspondence between the two. And like I was saying, you can either watch the controllers or not. We have implemented some dedicated IK solutions so the hands hold the hold the controllers nicely. And it's ready, like I said, to just plug and play into an application, even for collaborative VR, and be able to start working with others through natural gestures and having the avatar fully following your movements correctly. However, when you use inverse kinematics, as you might know if you work in the area, there's still certain artifacts that appear because of noise coming from the sensors, small rotations of the trackers that you have positioned on the body, or the IK solutions inconsistent in time, one frame not being consistent with the previous frame. So before I go into that, just we did a quick evaluation of this asset, comparing the computation of exact offsets in our pipeline to locate yourself inside the avatar correctly, as opposed to having fixed offsets with the trackers. And we overall got higher levels of embodiment when these exact offsets were computed, and these initiation pipeline was followed to get the avatar correctly calibrated. So like I was saying before, nowadays there are many solutions to get avatars animated in virtual reality. Of course, you can go for expensive mock-up suits like Xsense or even optical systems. But typically, what we would like to have in the long run is solutions that can work with sparse tracking data. So for instance, the HTC Vive, for example, with just 3 additional trackers, or even better, in the future, if we could work only with head-mounted display and the controllers, which is what you typically have with most of the head-mounted displays that are sold for gaming for the general public, for example. So what you get here is that immersive cinematic solutions still have errors in the position of the avatar, still have errors when it comes to the movement of certain limbs of the body. And it would be nice if we could have a large database of ground truth mockup data in VR, interactive virtual reality, that we could then use to train machine learning algorithms to have animations as good as possible with this sparse input data, or even with the noise that might come from these sensors due to occlusions or due to interferences with other elements in the room. So this is something we're working on at the moment as part of this ITN network that we currently have. And with this, I finish the presentation of all the work we're doing at the moment. Thank you to the VIRBI group at UPC, because professors and students that have been collaborating in this work, and to the funding from the Ministerio de Educación in Spain, and also from the European Union through this Marie Curie innovative training networks that we have at the moment. So I will finish here and take any questions.